And one of the things we've been able to do is show that, for instance, THC binds to a protein in our brain to alleviate pain called the cannabinoid CB1 receptor. And we found that these terpenes engage that receptor as well, but they do so indirectly. So they're not actually directly activating the receptor, but they're changing the endogenous tone of our own body's cannabinoids.
Welcome to High Five with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guest, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
Today we're going to be discussing cannabis, terpenes, and terpenoids. Are they promising medicines? And the conversation today will be with Dr. Catherine Cahill. Dr. Cahill is a neuropharmacologist at the Haddow Center for Neuropharmacology and the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. Her work aims to advance mechanisms of substance use and chronic pain. Her research is funded through various NIH grants, including Heal Drug Development Proposals. Welcome, Dr. Cahill.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Would you mind just saying a little bit more about your background before we get into our questions?
Absolutely. So I trained as a pharmacologist, specifically pharmacology that studies drug action in the brain. And my keen interest is in studying mechanisms of chronic pain and the intersection between chronic pain and substance use disorders. So I've been doing this for a long time. And one of the things we realize about chronic pain is that it's not at all like acute pain. And we know that many of the medications that we currently have for treating chronic pain are just not effective enough. Most of them are just serendipitous discoveries, such as tricyclic antidepressants, anticonvulsant drugs like gabapentin. And opioids still remain, one of the main ways of treating both acute and chronic pain. But because of their substance use disorder risk, and there's, now evidence that maybe they're not effective for very long treatment paradigms, we want to try to discover new analgesic therapies for treating pain. And that led my interest to cannabis research, and that's why we're here today.
So our first question is, can you explain a bit what are terpenes and terpenoids? Are they normally found in cannabis products, and are they related to cannabinoids?
Yeah. Terpenes are actually a volatile hydrocarbon for those chemists in your audience, and they provide the odor scent for the cannabis plant. So there's about 150 different types of terpenes in cannabis, but any one plant, any one carnivore, usually has between 35 and 40 terpenes. Now, terpenes themselves are what's in what I would call the fresh plant, and mostly in the female plant, because cannabis comes in male and females, and primarily in the bud, but males can actually have terpenes as well. But terpenoids is actually when there's been some chemical modification of those terpenes. So, and they usually involves oxidation. So you can think of it as fresh. The terpene is the fresh compound, and then when the plant gets dried or cured and there can be some chemical modification, those terpenes can become terpenoids.
So are the terpenoids kind of the rancid of rancid butter, or?
Actually, we don't know a lot about the terpenoids that are made from cannabis plants. We know a little bit more about the terpenes themselves.
So now the terpenes, just before we get to our next question, are they cannabinoids, or are they a different chemical group?
They're a different chemical group, so they're not actually cannabinoids. So cannabinoids tend to have a different chemical structure. In chemistry terms, they have a benzene ring and they have oxygen molecules, and they look very different than the terpenes, and they're just different chemical structure completely than the cannabinoids.
So they just happen to be together. They're not.
But they happen to be together. Yes, the plant makes terpenes primarily because it attracts pollinators like bees and butterflies, moths, that sort of thing. But it also helps them fight against diseases and pests. So that's why the plant makes the terpenes.
And so it's interesting you said, and that's what gives the aroma to fresh cannabis, right? So
That's correct.
sounds like it attracts not just the bees, but also some consumers, perhaps.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay. So moving on then, what are thought to be some conditions for which terpenes might be beneficial? And in that regard, basically, which terpenes have you studied in your work and what types of experiments have you conducted?
Yeah, this is a whole emerging field, which is really exciting. And part of the reason people started even thinking about terpenes primarily is because patients that self medicate, whether for pain or for sleep or insomnia, really have their preference for specific cannabis plants that's dictated based on terpene content. So that's kind of where the interest started. And we know there's even been clinical trials where the primary cannabinoid, THC, doesn't seem to be as effective in treating pain as the whole plant. So there's a lot of interest in these terpenes. And most of it has been done in preclinical studies, but there's been a few clinical studies as well. And the ones I study are two of the main predominant terpenes in most of the cannabis plants, most of the cannabis carnivores. Chemovores, sorry, and that's myrcene and beta-caryophyllene. And myrcene is probably one of the most predominant ones, but you'll also find it in mangoes. And beta-caryophyllene is one of the ones that's thought to be really important in producing anti-inflammatory action. But getting back to just your initial question of terpenes themselves and what they can be used for, certainly pain and pain treatment is one of them. But what's quite interesting about terpenes is that they actually have antibacterial properties as well. And in fact, they're commonly found in things like cosmetics, like lipstick and mascara, etc. And that's to reduce bacteria growth in those. So there's limonene is one of them that's commonly found in these cosmetic products, which is kind of cool, really.
Yeah. So, well, part of the question was maybe you could say a little bit more. What kind of experiments are you conducting?
So most of my work is preclinical work, and I'm really looking to explore the analgesic or pain relieving effects of terpenes. And as I mentioned previously, we're primarily focusing on a monoterpene called myrcene, which is one of the most predominant terpenes in the cannabis plant, and beta-caryophyllene. So we discovered that myrcene actually has analgesic properties in its own right of being able to alleviate nerve pain or pain that's referred to as neuropathic pain that's caused by nerve injury. And the other terpene that we're looking at is beta-caryophyllene. And it's quite interesting because myrcene doesn't seem to have much effect at all on inflammatory type pain, but it does on nerve pain, and it's the opposite with beta-caryophyllene. So beta-caryophyllene seems to be really effective, at least in our hands, in models of inflammatory pain, but not neuropathic type pain.
So, can you say more? For example, what are some examples of inflammatory pain?
Sure. So inflammatory pain can be lots of different chronic pain conditions. So osteoarthritis is an inflammatory pain condition. So is rheumatoid arthritis. You
Hmm.
can also have visceral types of chronic pain like inflammatory bowel disease. But there's many, many different types of inflammatory pain syndromes.
Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful as well. Now,
Mhm.
so it sounds like some of these compounds have promising features. Have you been looking at what might be the mechanisms or the ways these compounds produce their effects?
Yes, we have actually. So we wanted to know, so in addition to getting your cannabinoids through the cannabis plant, we have in our own bodies an endogenous or within the body our own cannabinoid system. So we've been trying to study whether or not these terpenes actually directly modulate our body's own cannabinoid system. And one of the things we've been able to do is show that, for instance, THC binds to a protein in our brain to alleviate pain called the cannabinoid CB1 receptor. And we found that these terpenes engage that receptor as well, but they do so indirectly. So they're not actually directly activating the receptor, but they're changing the endogenous tone of our own body's cannabinoids. So we make different types of cannabinoids compared to the plant, and two of the main ones are anandamide and another one that I'll just refer to as 2-AG just because the name is complicated. But we've seen that by some very unique and sophisticated chemical analysis by liquid chromatography and mass spectroscopy that these terpenes enhance or increase the levels of our body's cannabinoids.
Okay, so they are not directly like THC, but they increase the inner availability of
Yeah.
these signaling molecules like anandamide.
Exactly. So most people have probably heard of endorphins, right? Through the opioid system. And those endogenous chemicals that bind to opioid receptors can help your own body fight pain transmission and throughout both, the central nervous system, both at the level of the spinal cord and the brain. And these endocannabinoids seem to do the same thing. And so they not only alleviate pain, but they also reduce stress, they reduce anxiety. So there's a lot in many, many different parts of the brain that seem to be important for physiological processes. So these terpenes are actually increasing these, and we see that different terpenes are probably doing different things in different parts of the brain, but that's still under investigation, and I don't want to go too far into that right now, but that's how we're thinking about it, is that they're really modulating kind of the emotional component of the pain experience rather than the sensory component. And the way I like to describe this to my students is pain is a very complex sensory experience, sensory and emotional experience. And when you think about it, you can think about it like music. So sometimes the volume of the music you could imagine as the intensity, but whether or not you like the style of music, especially if you're trying to concentrate on something, that could be the emotional part, right? So sometimes the intensity is not necessarily the best predictor of the pain experience. In fact, quality of life is really about the emotional, bothersome component. So, it's sometimes the intensity can be very low and you're controlling that intensity of the pain. But if it's bothering you so much that you can't go out and enjoy dinner with your friends, or you can't go to family events, or you can't work, those aspects of the pain experience are better predictors. And we think that the cannabinoid system is actually better at that than necessarily the sensory experience.
Okay. Now, do you know, or is there speculation about? I mean, we've been talking about terpenes that are specifically within cannabis.
Mhm.
Is there any thought that there's some kind of cooperative action, if you will? People have talked about the so-called entourage effect, that,
Yeah.
it takes a village, if you will, to.
Yeah.
Is there any thought about that terpenes somehow interact maybe with the potential beneficial anti-pain effects of, say, THC or something like that?
So I think most of that just comes from patient reporting, right? So they have their favorite cannabis products, and a lot of that is based on terpene content. And they say that, this particular plant really helps with my pain or helps with my sleep and insomnia, and this other one doesn't. So I think the terpenes are really driving a lot of this. But we don't know a lot yet. Cannabis is still a Schedule 1 drug federally, so trying to get, research funded and also being able to just get the cannabis plant to be able to do research is still a concern.
Right. Actually, that leads us to the next question I was going to ask, and that is, what is the regulatory status of terpenes, are they controlled substances like THC and other psychoactive cannabinoids?
No, actually, they're not. So you can get them even on Amazon. So, like for instance, even lavender is a terpene, right? So it's not in the cannabis plant. Terpenes, myrcene, beta-caryophyllene, you can get pretty much anywhere, and they're considered safe by the Food and Drug Administration, and they're also been approved as food additives by the U.S. Flavor and Extract Manufacturers Association. But I will say, one of the things about the cannabis plant is it's really good at taking toxins out of the soil. And so those toxins can end up in contaminating those terpenes. So you want to be very, very careful about the source of the terpenes and making sure there's no pesticides or other types of contaminants in that product.
So, just a question. This is a little off point on me, but if you were doing, and maybe if you don't do human research, you couldn't answer this question, but I'm wondering if investigators could even do human trials with these things. Even though they're available on Amazon, sometimes you can't actually do a clinical trial because they weren't manufactured
Yeah.
certain
So you,
standards. Do you
yeah,
know anything about that, or?
Yep. So you can do clinical trials on terpenes. So there's a couple of different sources that's available that are approved because they do third party analysis for content, and also, as I said, making sure that they don't have contaminants in them. So there are clinical trials actually going on right now at UCLA specifically with terpenes and trying to understand their potential for relieving pain as well. But primarily not in like a clinical pain condition. It's primarily with, just a acute pain stimulus, like putting your hand in a bucket of ice water kind of pain, so experimental pain. But you can get terpenes that are approved and being used for clinical trials.
Okay, great. Now, there's a lot of interest in, certainly in the cannabis space, about sex differences in experience and response.
Mhm.
Have you found any sex specific effects in your research on the terpenes?
Actually, we have, which is kind of interesting. So, with beta-caryophyllenes, you can look at different doses and the dose response relationship for being able to alleviate pain, certain types of pain associated with that nerve injury. And we found myrcene was more effective in females than they were in males, which is quite interesting. Now, we don't see that with beta-caryophyllenes, so it's not universal. But one of the things I'll say is that there's actually a lot of sex differences even in the human brain about levels of the receptor, the protein that binds things like THC, but also even the levels of the endogenous cannabinoids that you produce to be able to, neuropeptides that regulate your body.
So you're saying that the CB1 receptor, for example, density is different?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's
Is it also a
interesting.
regional difference, regional
There
distribution, or is it just
There
the
are yeah, there are regional differences and there's even age-related differences. So early on, men have more cannabinoid receptors, CB1 receptors than women. But then as women age, specifically like middle age, their cannabinoid levels actually, CB1 receptors go up, whereas men kind of stay the same. And we know that the cannabinoid receptor seems to be regulated by hormones. So, for instance, a circulating estradiol actually changes receptor density in the brain. So, I think that's actually quite an interesting phenomenon. But not only that, there are regional differences. So there's two main receptors in the brain that cannabinoids like THC bind to, cannabinoid receptor 1 and cannabinoid receptor 2. And one of the receptors, the CB2, is actually really much higher in women in an area of the brain that's important for descending modulation of pain. So we have a part of the brain called the periaqueductal gray that even electrical stimulation would produce enough analgesia for surgery. I mean, it's got a really dense population of neurons that project down to the spinal cord to completely be able to block pain transmission. And in women, there's more CB2 receptors in this brain region than in.
Interesting. And are there differences throughout the menstrual cycle and also with respect to menopause?
Yeah, so there's
Do we
been.
know?
So we don't know a lot yet, but we definitely. There was a study that was, again, the one that I'm aware of was done at a UCLA with Ziva Cooper's lab with a former trainee of hers. And they were looking at basically just how the different menstrual cycle predicted whether or not the THC was going to produce kind of euphoric or, kind of psychoactive effects. And so we do see that. Now, in the context of menopause and that sort of thing, I'm not familiar with that research, but I do know that there is definitely regulation by female sex hormones.
Great. Well, now, just wrapping up, are there any other items you think would be of interest in regard to the possible therapeutic?
I think there's a lot. So my focus is primarily on, looking at terpenes for their specific analgesic effects. But, one of the areas I really want to get into is how they're modulating the analgesic effects of other things like the cannabinoids themselves, like cannabidiol or CBD, as well as THC. But the other potential of these drugs is that they could be opioid sparing, which would reduce the reliance on high doses of opioids for being able to manage pain. So I think there's a lot to be done because of the fact that they seem to be really good at being able to modulate kind of that affective dimension of pain. That's what we really want to capture and how we can best kind of amplify that aspect. So one of the reasons I think a lot of drugs have failed in clinical trials as novel analgesics is because they're purely looking at that sensory component and not the emotional bothersome component. And one of the things both cannabinoids and opioids do, which is what everybody wants to go to for managing their pain, is that they have the ability to do both. They have the ability to reduce that sensory component, but also that bothersome component.
Okay, well, great. We've been talking with Dr. Catherine Cahill from UCLA about the potential therapeutic uses of terpenes and terpenoids plants. I do want to thank you, Dr. Cahill, very much for taking the time to speaking with us. This is a very fascinating area, and particularly the idea that these compounds may enhance the activity of other anti-pain medicines and maybe reduce the amount that is necessary and reduce the toxicity of these things. That sounds like a very exciting thing.
I completely agree. This is why we're really interested in this research.
Terrific. Well, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for the invitation, and happy to receive any further questions from your audience in the future.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms, or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.